Hey, hi, hello, I'm Gladsome, and today I want to talk to you about a 2011 animated children's film called Gnomeo and Juliet. Directed by Kelly Asbury, it is based on William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, if you couldn't tell by the pun. Now, Kelly Asbury also co-directed Spirit, the Stallion of the Cimarron with Lorna Cook, which has nothing to do with today's video. I just wanted to say something positive about work he has done, and I really like that movie. However, we're talking about Romeo and Juliet today. Now, I love Shakespeare, and I have big feelings about when his plays are adapted, especially when we're talking about it being adapted for children. And thinking about Shakespeare, a lot of his plays have problematic content based on today's standards, or very difficult content, so we have to be thoughtful when we adapt these things for children. So the way that we choose to show that to children and the way that we choose to either make that a comedy, completely changing the themes and the narratives within that story, are we choosing to show them no death because we don't think kids can handle that, and therefore we're not making a tragedy anymore, but making it a comedy, in the case of Gnomeo and Juliet? And in that case, are we even showing them Shakespeare's plays or even something close to it because it's now completely different from the source material? That is a very complicated thing to go into, and today that is not my point. My point today is that I'm going to tell you how Gnomeo and Juliet shows kids that violence has no consequences. The short summary is that there are two gardens, the Red Garden and the Blue Garden, both alike in dignity and such and such. Each of them have gnomes that speak in both British and American accents because the actors are just using their own dialects. And they are feuding over something that they can't remember what it was, but there's been a long residing resentment toward each other. They both reside in the backyards of two different houses, the to-be house and the not-to-be house, haha, because, you know, Hamlet. And these houses are owned by Mrs. Montague for the Blue Garden and Mr. Capulet for the Red Garden. They don't matter all that much, besides the fact that Gnome uses Mrs. Montague's computer to order the Terraforminator lawn mower thing for the ending war. But other than that, they're just there for a wink and the nod at the original play. Gnomeo is the confident son of Lady Blueberry in the Blue Garden, and Juliet is the adventurous daughter of Lord Redbrick in the Red Garden. They both are missing a parent, unlike in the original play. I think this is just to avoid paying extra voice actors for more voices. Or it could be that, you know, why have two parents? The character of the nurse is portrayed by Nanette the Frog in this version. She's kind of obnoxious and ditzy and played kind of stupid. She's only aware of things sometimes, but she also can pick up on things at other times. This happens to the nurse character a lot, where she's played as kind of stupid or silly and boisterous and loud and obnoxious, when she's actually quite a thoughtful and caring figure, and I just don't like how she's portrayed in adaptations and also play productions of this particular show. Tybalt is Romeo's rival. He's still Tybalt in this version, and he's Gnomeo's rival. Here's a crucial difference. The character of Mercutio and the character of Benvolio, Romeo's friends, are combined in this particular movie into the character of Benny. He's a character who ends up massacring the Red and Blue Garden accidentally. Well, the Red Garden was on purpose, the Blue Garden was accidental because he's just bad at what he does, and he ends up ordering a lawnmower he can't control and he can't drive. That's a future point, we'll get there. There's also the character of the priest who marry Romeo and Juliet and kind of acts as this observer and party outside of the familial dynamics. That character is portrayed by the flamingo, the plastic flamingo, Featherstone. I don't know why this flamingo is animate. There's also a doll who's animate later. I don't know why the gnomes are animate objects and also certain other objects, but not other objects. Don't ask about the dramaturgy or the rules of the world. It's a lot. Anyway, the plastic flamingo Featherstone acts as this third-party observer who's not a part of the gardens, who offers this sense of balance and thoughtful commentary to Gnomeo and Juliet and helps them resolve some of their arguments throughout the movie. The movie follows the various shenanigans between these two gardens as they continue feuding. The short summary of that is the Red Garden and the Blue Garden frequently have lawnmower races together in the alleyway. This is what they do instead of sword duels because it's a children's film. At one point, though, Tybalt ends up cheating and Gnomeo's lawnmower is destroyed in the street, and there's a big argument about that. The Blue Garden, Gnomeo and Benny specifically, end up sneaking into the Red Garden to vandalize Tybalt's lawnmower, but instead of that, because Benny's incompetent, he vandalizes Tybalt's well, and they end up getting caught, but they also escape. As revenge, the Red Garden, Tybalt specifically, ends up cutting down the prized wisteria in the Blue Garden. Because this is very damaging, because it's the last thing that Gnomeo's father grew very thoughtfully in the garden, Gnomeo is told to go take revenge on the Red Garden. They try to poison the prized tulips in the Red Garden, but Gnomeo almost ends up spraying Juliet with weed killer, and then they run away from each other, so they end up failing at that task, and then Benny grows suspicious. As Benny runs away because he finds out that Gnomeo and Juliet are together, Tybalt tries to take him out and ends up cutting off his entire gnome hat. Angry, Gnomeo jumps on Tybalt's lawnmower and they end up fighting on it. Gnomeo is able to get off the lawnmower, but Tybalt keeps going and smashes into a wall and shatters to a lot of little pieces. The Red Garden ends up mobbing Romeo and he runs into the streets, and then the Blue Garden and Red Garden are watching and they think he gets run over by a car. But he's not, he lives. Because Benny has a lot of big feelings about this, he ends up ordering Death Incarnate the lawnmower, the Terraferminator, and uses it to try and destroy the Red Garden, not caring if he smashes any of the gnomes. But because he's, again, incompetent and bad at everything he does, he loses control of the vehicle, and it ends up careening into the Blue Garden and destroying the Blue Garden as well. This leads to the two gardens fighting on foot, so they're throwing tomatoes and blueberries at each other. Because it's a kid's movie, they can't actually be hitting each other, but they do tackle each other. Anyway, long story short, the Terraferminator, because it's still out of control, ends up careening into a pedestal that Juliet is glued down to. That's another thing. Juliet's father glues her down to a pedestal to keep her from hurting herself, but it puts her in danger. Gnomeo's there. They think Gnomeo and Juliet died after the Terraferminator crashes into it, and they should have, but we'll get to that. This results in Lady Blueberry and Lord Redbrick saying the feud is over. It has to stop. Our children are dead. Then they realize, oh, Gnomeo and Juliet aren't dead, they're alive, huzzah, there's a big dance party, Tybalt is glued back together. Gnomeo and Juliet are wedded and live happily in holy matrinomy. They all live happily ever after, blah, blah, blah. During all of those shenanigans, Gnomeo and Juliet do meet, love at first sight, they flirt. Something unusual here is that they meet, they're interested in each other, they're able to talk and flirt a bit before they realize they're from separate gardens because they meet in disguise. And then it's only later that they're like, oh, we like each other, but now we realize we're from separate families. So they actually get to have caring relationship before everything. Overall, it is very formulaic. There's a number of bad jokes. There's a bunch of winks and nods at Shakespeare plays and quotes. Some of those are funny. I do like them. But there's also the movie has the audacity to have the one character say, I think I like this ending better because it's happy and comedic. Even though the movie itself isn't good and it doesn't teach kids anything. Well, it does. We'll get to that. It's just not good, and it thinks it is, and that's infuriating. But it did get a bad Rotten Tomato score, which makes me feel a little better, I guess. But my main point is, it teaches kids that violence has no consequences, or that violence is comedic. In this film, there are 3 types of violence. Number 1 is the external versus the gnomes. This would be bulldogs, this would be humans, this would be vehicles like cars or construction vehicles. Number 2 is gnomes versus gardens or their overall environment. This would be vandalizing garden wells, cutting down wisteria, or trying to poison the tulips, or even taking down the fences. This is just destroying anything within their environment. Number 3 is gnome versus gnome violence. This would include the lawnmower races that are actively kind of dangerous. This would be the vegetable fruit war at the end and when they're tackling each other. This would also be the parental abuse that occurs between Gnomeo and his mom and Juliet and her father. This is nothing super serious because this is a kid's film. This is just that Gnomeo's mom kind of uses some emotional tactics and manipulation to get Gnomeo to do things for her. This would be Lord Redbrick gluing his daughter's feet to a pedestal so she can't go anywhere and hurt herself, or trying to get her to be interested in Paris because he thinks she needs companionship to protect her. Those kinds of things. So, is the violence supposed to be scary or comedic? The film waffles between these two options a lot. The final battle is them throwing tomatoes and blueberries at each other, which is supposed to be kind of funny, but we're also supposed to be stressed and worried about what is going to happen to these gnomes. The gnomes actively fear being shattered, but at the end of the film, the one gnome who is shattered and we think is dead for part of the film is okay and glued back together. The only consequences that come from smashing or destroying part of a gnome is when Benny's hat is cut off. But that leads to the question of, if Tybalt was glued back together, why couldn't Benny's hat be glued back together? It doesn't make sense. Violence has no life or death consequences for these gnomes. Like I said, Tybalt's put back together. Benny, who does lose his hat, is okay in the end. Juliet, who falls from a tree, who's glued to a pedestal, who falls from a greenhouse window at one point, is fine. The fear of being shattered is always present, but it's never a reality. We never have to worry about it. I think the only reason that Tybalt ends up being shattered is because that is originally originally a Shakespeare plot point that is kind of crucial for the story to continue. The only death that is actually permanent in the film is Gnomeo's father and Juliet's mother. And these are only mentioned at the top of the film super briefly. We don't know the details of the loss besides some external factor occurred. And this seems to just be a contrivance so that Juliet's father can be overprotective and Gnomeo's mother can be concerned and really trying to carry the community and do her best. Overall, these don't really matter to the story besides those character details for the parents. So these deaths can technically be counted, but a child who is watching who only hears this super brief mention might not be affected by it, and I think this is how they're skating by with there was a loss, but you don't really see it, so it's okay, the kids will be fine. Or it could be that they didn't want to pay more voice actors, that's my bet. And it's not just death, it's also damage. The scratches, the scuffs, the roughness that a gnome might have at the start of the film is how they will look at the end of the film. The only exceptions are Tybalt and Benny, who do receive damages, but this is again because those are original Shakespeare plot points that are needed to get the story to continue. Everyone else looks exactly how they did at the beginning of the film. This is a very apparent with Juliet, who is pristine and pretty and is told she's delicate and who is fighting against those things and being like, I'm not delicate, I can do things, is still beautiful and pristine at the end of the film. She has some little blemishes because, there was a battle, but those are easily washed off. Gnomeo, who's shown to be a little rougher, who has some dents and some scratches and some little things, has those same dents and scratches at the end of the film. Nothing for him really changes. If they are the lead characters, they have to remain in the same state they were at the beginning of the film, and the only characters who are really affected by actual damage or almost death are the characters who are crucial plot points from the original Shakespeare film, with the exception of Romeo and Juliet, because they died at the end of that play. Every almost death is not really scary, it's almost funny sometimes. Near the beginning of the film, Juliet falls from a tree. It freaks her dad out, but that's supposed to be funny. Gnomeo and Benny are thrown up into the air by a water hose, and they end up comedically finding a way to get out of it. Even Gnomeo and Juliet, their first meeting where they're in danger because they're almost falling from a greenhouse a couple of times, is meant to be flirty and delightful and amusing, not something that is scary. A lot of the violence isn't really violence. It's meant to be like, oh, but okay, we're okay. It's not something that has real consequence. We don't ever see a consequence. Nothing has permanence, and that is what is infuriating. The reason that Romeo and Juliet is a very compelling play is that these two people who find each other and fall in love, however you feel about that, find this love in the midst of cyclical violence happening between two feuding families from older generations that they are now growing up within and trying to figure that out as two young kids. And then because they're trying to figure it out and they don't know how because they're in a big world as young kids fighting against adults, that they end up losing their lives because their only solution that they can think of is a childish solution, but they hope and think will work. In this film, the feuding between the families is not cyclical violence really, and much more of YouTuber prank wars gone a little too far. There's not a lot of stakes to it. It doesn't feel like reality. And again, yes, they're gnomes. But the point is that kids can comprehend a lot, and we're not giving them the ability to comprehend because we're telling them there's not really a danger, no one really shatters. Tybalt is fine at the end, he's in the dance party. The only real loss is an environmental loss because both of the gardens are destroyed at the end. But even then, during the dance party, we don't really see the gardens, we just get to see fine little grass and flowers, so everything's fine. There are two important changes I need to tell you about that this movie does that are different from Romeo and Juliet. I have briefly mentioned that Mercutio is not in this movie because he is combined with Benvolio as the character Benny. This is an issue though, because Mercutio is the death that leads to Romeo fighting with Tybalt, killing Tybalt, and then being banished. However, in this film, the stakes are so much lower. Yes, Benny loses his hat, and it's portrayed as this really devastating thing. However, we don't lose a life. It doesn't feel like this is an eye for an eye. It doesn't feel like both families immediately are having this really difficult, we've lost two family members, and therefore we have to banish Romeo to protect him so that we don't have to do another an eye for an eye engagement and have him killed. There are all these circumstances that are around the fact that Mercutio and Tybalt are two characters who are lost, that well, for lack of a better word, are lost in this movie. The stakes are so much lower, and it also means that the movie has to counteract it so heavily by making Tybalt's death a super big accident. They have to make Gnomeo the good guy still. So Gnomeo ends up trying to warn Tybalt about the walls coming up, you have to look for the wall, and he ends up escaping because Tybalt won't let him go. So Tybalt has had to be made into this brutish figure, this like really intensely evil person in order to make this death justifiable because there isn't a Mercutio to balance it out. The second thing is there is no prince character. The prince in Romeo and Juliet is named Aeschylus. He rules over the city, so it means that these two feuding families are not just in this silo of just being two feuding families like in this movie. There is a society and a community happening around them outside of these families that are being harmed and affected by their feud. The prince is the one who comes in, engages with that, and says, hey, if you keep doing this, there will be consequences because you're harming this entire city. And while you can argue whether or not that's super effective or if he chose to come in super late because he didn't want to be involved with it, whatever. The point is there's no third party observing enforcement to get the families to agree to stop the feud. They come to that decision on their own, magically. Benny isn't even blamed for ordering the Terraforminator. There's nothing like that. These are two garden families that are happening in isolation. There is no society around them that is being affected or harmed by what they're doing, besides Mrs. Montague and Mr. Capulet, who are already feuding as two neighbors. At the end of the film, Gnomeo turns to Juliet and says, I don't know about you, but I like this ending much better. Which could be a cute little nod to Shakespeare's play of going, haha, I like a comedy better than a tragedy. But by making it a comedy, it fails to represent the conflict, the cyclical violence, a lot of the messaging that comes from the original play. There is not a true loss for this community. There's no consequences for all the intense violence that we do get to see. So even when we see bad things happen, there's nothing super bad that results from them because everyone is okay at the end. It makes a lot of the messaging kind of like a joke, a haha, wasn't that a big silly prank that we all pulled? The thing about Romeo and Juliet as a play though is that even at the end, all the horrific things that have occurred, all this loss and death, might be for nothing. Because at the end, the fathers are still kind of one-upping each other, saying this is how I'll honor my child, or this is how I'll honor your child. So we aren't even sure if it's gonna be a true thing that holds. A lot of the time when this projection is put on, that's usually the message they go with, is we have to stop. But textually, you could go in the other direction of, it won't, even though we've lost these kids. Gnomeo and Juliet brushes all of this off with, everyone was fine. Even the people who were smashed are fine. Everything is okay. No one can actually sustain injuries fully. All this violence was just let's not do that anymore. Oh, shucks, guys, we should stop, really. Hear me out. If this film wanted to even remotely send an interesting message to kids, keep it a comedy. However, Gnomeo and Juliet should have been smashed to pieces at the end. Stay with me. I'm not saying we should make the kids deal with death if that's what you're worried about. I think kids can process a lot of things, including loss. What I'm trying to say, though, is that if you're trying to adapt some of the messaging from Shakespeare's play, have Romeo and Juliet die, be smashed to pieces. These two gardens then have to unite to rebuild these two people from their community. It then shows that they're not two separate communities caring about one individual, but two communities becoming a whole community to protect both of these people who are part of this bigger whole. This is about older generations of gnomes taking care of the newer generation, rebuilding them, bringing them back. It also then lets Juliet have that autonomy of, I'm not fragile, I don't need to be pristine. She has some scratches, she had to be glued back together, but she's still who she is, you know? This brings up a super random side note, but the gnomes have parents, which means they procreate, and I don't know what to do with that. Because both Gnomeo and Juliet have parents, but at the same time, what if the owners of the houses decide to just get rid of a gnome that they don't like anymore, or they give it away as a gift? Does that mean you're separating families? This is it's causing me a lot of crisis I don't need to deal with. The dramaturgy of the world is incomplete, but we'll work with it, you know? I don't like Gnomeo and Juliet as a Shakespeare adaptation, and I really don't like it as a Shakespeare adaptation for kids. It does not really have a message, and the one it seems to have is contrary to everything that the play is about. It is a completely different play. What you could say is the whole point of adaptation is it completely changes the status of what a play was. But it tries so hard to carry a lot of the themes from the play without actually doing it well. You could say it's about two feuding families dealing with cyclical violence, but is it though? The violence keeps occurring throughout, both as a comedic thing, as a scary thing, as something that we should actually fear that our characters are lost. But they aren't, so a lot of it is just, these are two families kind of pranking each other and just dealing with that. And the only time the violence really matters is when it's the two children of the two leaders of the garden, Romeo and Juliet, who almost die, and then they decide to resolve things. It's not after Tybalt has been shattered, it is only after both of the children of the leaders of the garden are thought to be lost. Wait. Was this movie about classism the whole time? And that violence only matters when it affects the upper class? Well, fuck.